In this section, we will be building responsive utilities and charts. In this video, we will be using the parent dimensions of a div for rendering an initial visualization. We will make the div dimensions take up the entire window. We will get the dimensions of this div, and we will pass the dimensions of this div to our chart, and the dimensions that the chart gets will update the chart elements. So let's get to it. Here is our index.html file. The unique elements of this file are that the body has a div with an ID of chart wrapper. This will be where we put our visualization. We're going to include a library file where we will develop some helper functions, and we're going to include an index.js file where we will call the functions to build the chart. We add some style to our chart wrapper div. We will set the position to absolute, and we will set the dimensions so that this div takes up the entire view window at all times. In our index.js file, the first thing we do is grab the element by its ID and assign it to a variable. Next, we will take that variable and pass it to a function called getWidth and height. We will assign the results of this to a variable called dimensions. We're going to build a function called getWidth and height in our library file. Let's do that. We build a function called getWidth and height that takes the div ID. We get the height and the width of the div ID using the client height and the client width, and we return from this function an object with the width variable and the height variable. In our index.js file, we can access the width and height variables by using dimensions.width and dimensions.height. Next, we will create an SVG element and add some attributes to it. We use D3's select method to select the element, and we append an SVG element to the D3 selection, and we add some attributes to the SVG element. We set the width to the dimensions.width, and we set the height to the dimensions.height. Now, our page has an SVG element that is as wide and tall as the parent div, which is as big as the screen. When we inspect our element in the console, we see that we have our chart wrapper and our SVG element. Our SVG element takes up the entire available size of the screen on render. First, we will create a scale for the rectangle. We will set the rectangle to be almost as tall as the entire screen and to be centered from left to right. The first thing we will do is create a Y scale to map the height of the rectangle. We will set the domain from 0 to 1 because we don't really have any data, and we will set the range from 20, which is near the top of the screen, to the full height of the page using dimensions.height. We will also append a rectangle to the SVG wrapper. We will assign some attributes as well. The X value will be half of the width to put the rectangle in the middle of the screen horizontally. The Y position will put the rectangle near the top of the screen. The height of the rectangle will be 90% of the height of the screen. The width will be 20, and the fill and the stroke will be steel blue to give it some color, and it will have a class of myRectangle. Let's see what this looks like on our page. When we refresh the page, we now have a rectangle in the middle of the screen. Also, when we resize the screen and refresh the page, the rectangle consumes the height and the width of the window and re-renders the rectangle based on the dimensions of the window. Resize and refresh, resize and refresh. The rectangle is as expected in the middle of the screen horizontally and almost as tall as the screen. In this video, we've used the parent div dimensions for the initial rendering of an element on the screen.